Hello. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Amelia Holmes, and I am really excited to introduce you to our speakers. Charmaine Bonner is the Processing Archivist at Arizona State University Library. She is responsible for arranging, describing, accessioning, and reboxing manuscript collections. After a collection is physically processed, she writes the finding aid for each collection to describe the collection's content and other important information. She obtained her master's degree in library science at North Carolina Central University. Jessica Salow is currently a specialist at Arizona State University Library with the community-driven Archives Initiative, which was established in 2017 through the generous support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. She obtained her master's in library and information science from the University of Arizona and is an alumna of Arizona State University. I'm going to turn it over now to Charmaine and Jessica. Thank you.
Hi, Amelia, thank you so very much for that introduction. We greatly appreciate it. Welcome. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. So Charmaine's going to go ahead and share her screen in order to get that presentation up and going. So our agenda tonight will be what's an archive and an archivist, where genealogical and archival research meet, getting started, online resources, Nantucket Historical Association resources, how one family's collection told the story of a community of finding aid study, items from personal collection, and the importance of document analysis. So, what is an archive and an archivist? We always like to ask this question, what people know about the functions of an archive and what an archivist does. So I don't know if anybody wants to answer this particular question in the chat as to what they think an archive is and what an archivist does. As you can see from the screen, we did put what we interpreted as what an archive and an archivist does. And so what we state for archive is that an archive is an active space where past and present merge. It contains primary resources that preserve the history of several generations. And then an archivist is a person that organizes and preserves that archive. So for example, I'm an archivist technically here at Arizona State University Library. My official title is a specialist, but I am an archivist here at ASU Library. And that is with the Community-Driven Archives Initiative, which does a lot of outreach and relationship building with marginalized communities here in Arizona. And then Charmaine is the processing archivist, as Amelia said, here at ASU Library, which means she works really directly with the documents within our collections by processing and arranging them to make them accessible to the public at large. Go ahead to the next screen. So within the work that we do in a traditional archive, records can be almost anything. And so when we're talking about where genealogical and archival research meet, we want to talk about some of the specific records that you can find when you're looking through an archive and whether or not that can assist you with the genealogical research that you try to conduct for your family research or community research. So when we're talking about the archival records, this includes photographs, artifacts, and by what we mean when we say artifacts, those are non-document or photograph items like buttons, pins, banners, clothing. It just depends on what the definition of an artifact is, but it can be pretty broad. And so we also talk about within archive oral histories and correspondence, but many archive collections contain traditional genealogical records such as family trees, family Bibles, and such, but many archival records that aren't traditionally seen as genealogical records can also be used for that purpose. And that includes newspaper articles, scrapbooks, letters. It just really depends. So here at ASU Library, we have multiple collections that document local businesses, and that includes records that have employee records, accounting records, even some business records that include legal proceedings that were either started against the company or that were started by the business. Many archival collections document families, their neighbors, and even an entire town, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And that could also lead to important genealogical discoveries for people who lived in that area or who have family in that community. And when we say family papers, they're also donated to archives and can serve general patrons' interest, but also are genealogical research items that can assist you with the research that you're trying to do. Your family may not donate to a library or historical association or an archive, but there are other ways genealogical records have significant materials that you can find within an archive. This includes information regarding a neighbor's family, the company, or information about individuals that are within that company that possibly your relative worked at or had some type of business with. Or it can include information about an ancestor who was active within the community or city or organization that is in the town that you either came from or are currently living in. And sometimes the provenance or background of how materials made their way into an archive is unknown, which happens quite frequently, unfortunately. And we have quite a few examples here at ASU Library where that actually did happen. So for a local Massachusetts example, we have the Florence Higginbotham papers, which currently are housed at the Museum of African American History in Boston, which contains letters and postcards from women who stayed at the Florence Higginbotham house in Nantucket. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about possibly those records, please visit the Museum of African American History, either their website or if once everything is open again, you could possibly go to Boston and see those records. And specifically for your Nantucket Historical Society, there is the Ship's Logs collection, which is called number MS-220, which contains logs generally kept by captains or first mates of ships, chiefly sailing out of Nantucket. And that information includes longitude and latitude records, weather records, ship sightings, records of whales seen or taken, and then crew member information, cargo information, ports that were visited, and sometimes contain poems or drawings from the people on the ship, and also sometimes their journals. So when we think about sources of information asked, you want to ask some of the following questions. What kind of sources could hold important family history information? What kinds of records have you produced? And this includes thinking about examples like, obviously a birth certificate, that's pretty general, pretty common knowledge. And then marriage licenses as well for anybody within your ancestral line that had a marriage that you can find. Baptismal records, newspaper interviews, headstones. There's so much information that you can pick up from those particular things. So please ask those questions. And then I'll go ahead and turn this over to Charmaine.
Thank you, Jessica. So I wanted to add to that, that I actually found my fourth great grandfather's sharecropping agreement from 1865 or 1866 at the University of Georgia. It's one of those collections that the provenance or the background of how it got there is unknown. But how I found that item was researching within the finding aids at University of Georgia. It is the closest, biggest university to the region in which my family's from in Georgia. So just out of curiosity, I began searching my family name, searching the region that they're from, the town, and I happened upon this document, which was listed under a slave trade documents collection. And it only contains that sharecropping agreement and then I believe a purchase certificate or log from that family that had formerly enslaved my own family. But in doing my research in University of Georgia's finding aids, coming upon this type of document, I'm sure there's a lot more documents there at University of Georgia. It's just all about finding and researching finding aids. It's about knowing which terms to look for. So it's a little bit more difficult than maybe like a Google search, but it's not impossible, and you can really find a great wealth of information when researching finding aids. So the next slide, I will be discussing, move that to the slide. So the next slide, I will be discussing getting started, understanding history and context. So before the official research process can begin, preliminary research has to be done first. So this type of preliminary research can include information gathering by speaking to family, friends, and others who may know your family history, especially your elders. It's also important to record this information with the permission of your elders and whomever is being recorded, and write notes as they speak or write notes later. One thing I want to note from an archivist perspective, if you are doing an oral history recording, it's important to get a signed permission of that oral history, especially if you plan to donate to an archive at any point. We want to make sure that the permissions have been granted by the person being interviewed. So oral history interviews or recordings can be done with your cell phone. Many cell phones have that capability, including my phone, which is an iPhone, and I've done oral histories on that. You can also do oral histories on a tape recorder, which I would suggest making that investment in a tape recorder if you plan on continuing your oral history project among your elders and other people in your family. The next step is learning the basics of the local history in the area in which you're researching in. This is an important step because understanding that local history will inform you of many things that happened during your ancestors' lives and how those things may have affected them. And also knowing the local history, you'll know where to look for the documents and which documents might exist and proper research terms and places. For example, knowing that Nantucket used to be known as Sherburne before 1795. So by knowing that information, you won't look for a Nantucket in the year 1700. So in knowing the right kinds of information to look for, knowing your history, this will guide you to the right kinds of sources. By understanding your historical research and the context in which those people lived in the area in which you're researching, you'll know that there were industries such as whaling in Nantucket or whichever industries are in the location in which you're researching. And so in that case, there might be employee records like Jessica mentioned, or other kind of records that may have been produced by the type of industry that was popular in the region in which you're researching. It's also important to note that boundary lines and even counties change over the years. For example, in my own research, I learned that Banks County, Georgia was formed from Franklin and Habersham County in Georgia. So knowing this information led me to a variety of different resources and information, but I had to research in Franklin, Habersham, and Banks County to find that information. Understanding the context of your ancestors' lives will lead you to their basic life information, their relationships and events that affected them or in which they participated in. For example, who could and couldn't file for a military pension and in what period? What kinds of limitations were there for women or Black, Indigenous people of color? And when were they able to file for certain documents or even be counted on certain documents, like the census, for example, knowing that 1870 was the first census that Black Americans who were formerly enslaved were counted on by name. In the context of this modern COVID-19 pandemic and its parallel to the Spanish flu, for example, was there a Spanish flu outbreak in the area in which you're researching, where your ancestors lived? How did the Spanish flu impact them? These are questions to keep in mind while you're doing your research. In the context of Black family history research, having an understanding of the Great Migration, when it began, why people migrated from the South, and point a more nuanced story of your ancestors' lives. When we think about names, naming patterns have changed across the centuries. Having a knowledge of 1800s to 1900 era names and shortened versions of names can lead to genealogy discoveries, like how Thos or THOS was short for Thomas. A personal example of this is when I was researching my third great grandmother, whose name was Dealey Wiley. I could not find a Dealey Wiley on the census or really in any documentations outside of my second great grandmother's death certificate. So by chance, I decided to research what Dealey might be short for, and I found that Cordelia was the long version of Dealey, and Dealey was a nickname of Cordelia. So at that point, I began to research Cordelia Wiley, and I was able to locate her on the 1870 census. So Ancestorville.com has two great lists for Victorian era female and male shortened names and nicknames. And I have linked that in the handout, and I believe that is a very crucial source because your ancestors won't always be listed by their, I guess, proper first name. Sometimes it will be a nickname or a shortened version of their name. So in this next slide, I will discuss documenting the research process. So the first step is to fill out a family group sheet. This helps you to organize your information. And this sheet contains a chart that will give you the space to fill out your ancestor's name, other basic information such as their spouse, birth, and their death dates, where they were born, where they died, along with marriage information, children, occupation, and much more. This is, I believe this should be your first step when you're attempting to research your family history, because this becomes sort of like a reference document to be able to pull when you are actually researching. And so I've linked a template to family group sheets in the handout, and I believe that's from Archives, the National Archives, and so that'll be in the handout for you. Citations are also a great way to keep track of where you get your information from, or information or records from. A sample citation could be as simple as Nantucket Historical Association, MS 200, Shiplogs Collection, Box 1, Folder 1. So this lets you know, or whomever gets your research down the line, know exactly which box and which folder that you found the information in. It is also important to make note of the path that you use to find a document when using websites like FamilySearch.org or Ancestry, because sometimes websites change, information is taken down, or just the path is changed in general. So by knowing how you got to that document, you'll be able to locate it even if the link changes on you. So when acquiring documents and records as you are going about the research process, it is important to save your research in more than one location in case of computer failure, natural disaster, and other factors. I suggest saving things in the cloud, as making a hard copy, printing out a hard copy, and saving it to your computer, or even your USB drive as well. So once you're ready to research, research questions and research plans can save you time and frustration. In the library, for example, we often have patrons that will ask for materials about a family surname, and the question is usually kind of broad. Tell me what you have on such and such family. Well, that can provide some difficulty, especially if there's a lot on that particular family name. And or if there's a lot on the family name or many boxes in the collection. So a good research question is specific, but not too narrow. For example, who was the wife of Monroe Brown, probably born in the mid-1860s in Georgia and living in Habersham County, Georgia from at least 1870 to 1930. This question is narrow enough to find my unique Monroe Brown, because this is my great-great-grandfather. Versus if I had asked, I'd like to know everything about the Brown family of Habersham County. And in the handout, I have linked an article about research questions that was created by the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society. So research plans are the next step to, once you've already formulated a research question, or you can research more, you can produce more than one research question. So your research plan should outline, what do you want to know? What do you already know? What do you think you know? Or what do you think the answer is, which I call my theory whenever I'm researching a particular person. What sources or records contain the answer, and do they exist? And lastly, if the records exist, where can I find them? These are questions to keep in mind when developing your research plan. So genealogist Kimberly Powell has an article about research plans, and I've linked that as well. Lastly, research logs are a necessary part of the research process. It helps you to keep track of ancestors that you may have already researched and how you conducted that research when you did, what you found and what you did not find. This prevents you from repeating steps. And I will admit, I don't always follow creating a research log, but they are a very helpful part to the genealogical research process, and probably would have saved me many hours of going down rabbit holes, only to find out I've already researched that way. So next, I will be discussing the online resources that I use for genealogical research and that are out there. So first I'll talk about familysearch.org, which is my favorite genealogical research tool. It is free and has many helpful features besides the record search feature, which is probably the one that I use the most. So one feature is the Family Search wiki pages. They explain more about historical collections and how to use them, as well as limitations of those collections. For example, the wiki page will let you know if certain years are not present. The Family Search catalog is very helpful as well. The catalog will direct you to digitized copies of publications and documents. For example, I was able to locate court records 1721 through 1816, court general sessions of the peace, Nantucket, Georgia, or Nantucket, Massachusetts, in the catalog. And so next to that resource was a camera icon, which indicates that that resource is digitized. And it will also let you know that where that resource actually lives and where it's located physically. But it's important to know that it is available online as well if you're not in Nantucket or aren't able to go in person. So another family search feature that I've enjoyed using is the Find a Collection section. You can locate this section by selecting Search, then Records, then at your bottom right will be the Find a Collection section. This will guide you through the Family Search historical collections. You can select Browse All if you're just curious to see what all of the different collections that they have, or you can type in the state of your choice. So for this presentation, I typed in Massachusetts, and I was able to locate the Maine and Massachusetts case files of deceased and deserted seamen, 1873 through 1965, which might be of interest to you all who are researching Nantucket and the Nantucket area. I wanted to also mention that NHA is a Family Search affiliate library, which means visiting NHA will give you access to Family Search digital collections that are not available in your home. The next resource is findthegrave.com. This is also another one of my favorites. It's an online gravesite directory that users contribute photos of headstones and cemetery of. Sometimes they contribute photos of the actual individual if there's an online memorial, and other content too, even biographies. Through through findagrave.com, excuse me, I was able to locate the gravesite of a fourth great grandfather. And this was very important because at the time when he passed, which was the late 1890s, Texas was not mandating death certificates. So this gravesite and headstone that I was able to locate is the only proof or information that I have as to when he passed away. So Nantucket's private cemeteries, St. Mary's and Prospect Hill, have been added to Find a Grave. Prospect Hill also has their own website, which I've linked to the handout. So Ancestry is probably one of the more famous resources, and it's a great resource to use. And it has many capabilities, just like Family Search, but with more access to records since it is subscription based. NHA has in-person access to Ancestry.com, so you have to visit NHA in person to use Ancestry, but they do have access there. The only downside I've seen to Ancestry is that it tracks your research steps, and then it shares those steps as suggestions with the leaves that we often get in our family trees or just on the side of the page while we're researching. So these suggestions can be helpful, but it can also be confusing at the same time. If, for example, someone added incorrect information or the wrong person to their tree, you can then get conflicting information. So I would say take the suggestions with a grain of salt and do your own research into it. So the next resource is newspapers.com. I've been aware of this resource for quite some time, but I became a member for the first time last year. And so it's been a great resource since that time. I have found obituaries in newspapers.com, also marriage and engagement announcement, death notices, along with just the general happenings and even gossip from the towns and areas in which I've been researching, all of which gives me a more well-rounded story of my ancestors. Because for me, I don't really have a lot of personal stories about ancestors because I believe I'm probably the first person in my family tree that has spent some time putting the family tree together and the family history together. So newspapers, I'm sure some other people think like me, but I used to think newspapers wouldn't be that valuable of a source because my family wasn't notable or wasn't a prominent family. And that's far from the truth. Newspapers of the past, I'll say maybe like pre-1980s, were a lot more personal than the newspapers of today's. And they included accounts of everyday people, especially if your family members were members of the clergy, education, community organizations. And I've even found accounts of certain ancestors who were farmers and some of their business dealings. It will say such and such has sold this plot to so-and-so. And so even that is very important, even if it's just a one line. So a local newspaper resource for Nantucket is the Nantucket Athenaeum Digital Historic Newspaper Archive. You can learn more about this at the NHA House History webinar. Okay, so in this slide, I'll discuss more about local Nantucket or Nantucket Historical Association resources. So first, I'll discuss the Barney genealogical record. This was created by Eliza Starbuck Barney and contains the births, deaths, and marriages of more than 40,000 Nantucketers over 2.5 centuries. This record does not contain any records of non-white Nantucketers, but it's still a very important source, especially since it spans over 2.5 centuries. The NHA Cemeteries database is very extensive and documents everyone in town-owned cemeteries through the year 2002. As I mentioned earlier, cemetery records are very important and sometimes can fill in the gap where a birth certificate or death certificate may not exist. The Sanborn maps were created to assist fire insurance agents in determining the degree of hazard associated with properties. So today they can be used as a way to create a story of the neighborhood in which your ancestors lived and worked in, and what they may have looked like. The next source is The Other Islanders. This was is a book or a compilation of information that documents the diversity of Nantucket's population, beginning with the indigenous people who were already residing here when the English settlement began, up through the 20th century. So it's very comprehensive. In that document, you learn about the formerly enslaved Black people who established the New Guinea neighborhood in Nantucket, where the African Meeting House, which is now a museum, is located, as well as the Black people who migrated to Nantucket to work as it became a tourist destination. So the Black History at NHA webpage includes oral histories, exhibits, writings, and other things documenting Black history in Nantucket. Isabel Kaudenbach has an inventory of Black Nantucketers, and it's likely to become a part of that Black History at NHA webpage. NHA also has had an oral history project called New Voices, Nantucket's Diverse Immigrant Populations. Those interviews have been digitized and made available in the online catalog. So now I'm going to turn this back over to Jessica.
Thanks, Charmaine. So as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about a local to Arizona history of one family's collection that told the story of a community. So as you can see from these slides, we're going to be speaking about the Ocampo family papers, which is in the Chicano Research Collection here at Arizona State University. Just a little bit about the Chicano Research Collection here at ASU. It is the largest Latino collection that documents Arizona's Latinx community here in Arizona. It was started in 1970 by Dr. Christine Marine. And for the last 50 years, it has been documenting local Arizona Latinx communities. So if you have an interest or know family members who are interested in learning more about the Latinx community here in Arizona, I do recommend that you visit the Chicano Research Collection here at ASU Library to learn more about Latinx history here in Arizona. So for the Ocampo family, this interesting collection here at ASU that documents one family, it's one family and an entire community. So if people are familiar with the geography of Arizona, this particular family lived in Wickenburg, Arizona, which was about 70 miles northwest from Phoenix. And this documented the Ocampo family from 1860 to about 1989. We have approximately 650 images from this collection, and it not only documented the Ocampo family, but it also documented the Quesadilla family and the Ortega family and the Valencia families who helped establish the town of Wickenburg, which was originally founded in 1863. We have two collections for the Ocampo family. One is all images that the family collected. These particular images document graduations, weddings, military service of family members, ranching, and commercial activities that were going on in the town of Wickenburg. The other collection is the Ocampo family papers, which includes personal papers of the family, and this includes house certificates, legal documents, newspaper articles, and as Charmaine said, those can be definitely important when you're trying to do genealogical research regarding families. But in this collection, it also had business records. professional records, architectural plans for not just homes that the families lived in, but also the town of Wickenburg, and other miscellaneous papers that documented the families that were mentioned above and the town of Wickenburg. This is an important genealogical research for other families from Wickenburg and their descendants of the families within the collection, and families that weren't necessarily highlighted within the collection might also be able to find some information about either ancestors, elders, or just town history of Wickenburg in general through this collection. So in addition to many neighbors, in-laws, the school gatherings that the Ocampo family collection documented, there were important, general sources about just town history. When people wanted to view this collection and all the collections at an archive you visit, finding aids really are the important resource for people to know about and have some understanding of how to look at and navigate a finding aid in order to find the information that you're looking for. So Charmaine's going to bring up an example of the Ocampo family finding aid that we have here at ASU. So this particular finding aid has a lot of information about not only the collection, but the source of the collection. And so if she starts scrolling through, you can see that, again, it includes some abstract information. It also includes information about the call number. So if you're looking to contact the repository that collections are at, make sure that you also document the identification number. And in this particular collection, it's MS102 is the collection number that you would include if you're trying to look for information regarding this particular collection. So if we can continue to scroll down, we just see the repository information. And then also you can see a bunch of information like a biographical information regarding the sources of the collection. And this particular biographical note states pretty much comprehensively names and birth dates and death dates of people in the Ocampo family that possibly, if you are related or are looking for information about who within the Ocampo family married somebody or had some type of possible either maiden name or family name. Those are really great resources to look in the biographical information of a finding aid and to possibly find that information. And so it gives so much genealogical information sometimes regarding the subject or the community that the collection is about. So if we continue to scroll through the finding aid, you'll also find a scope and content note. And this particular aspect of the finding aid is what is within the collection. And so if you see here, it says right here, it contains blueprints, postal and greeting cards, certificates, correspondence, publications, literally everything that you could possibly think of within a family collection, this particular collection has. And so, and then it also talks about the series, which we'll get into a little bit later, just kind of, documenting that these are personal papers, possibly are business papers, professional papers, anything along those lines. So if we keep scrolling through the finding aid, we find arrangement, which kind of, again, tells you how this particular finding aid is divided and the number of series that we have. And when we're talking about series, it's just kind of a thing within archives to let people know that just this is where the personal papers, so if you're looking specifically for personal papers, it's in this series only. And so this would be of personal interest to you if you're just looking for personal papers. And then if we keep scrolling, we find access restrictions. And then this is information about if there is any type of restriction that the family put on the collection, or if there are copyright restrictions, which, as you can see here, it does state that this collection retains copyright and that the Arizona Board of Regents, which is the higher level of the institution that runs most of the Arizona higher ed educations here in Arizona. So they retain the copyright for that particular, collection. And then, as you can see here, related information. So if there's any related information or other processing guides that you are looking to find regarding this collection, you can find it within this particular thing. And then we have access terms, and those obviously are the terms that people can use to possibly find information. And again, as you can see from here, it does list personal names. It lists subject names as, again, mining, mineral resources. Mining is very huge here in Arizona, so we have a lot of mining information, a lot of ranch information available within collections here in Arizona. And then again, if you keep scrolling, it just administrative information if you're looking for citations, if you're looking for provenance, and provenance means just original, kind of like dating back to the original family or person who donated that material and the provenance of where it originally came from. But the meat of a finding aid is the container list. And as you can see right here, this particular finding aid does list by box and by folder exactly what is in each box in each folder. So if you're looking here, series 1 personal papers, box 1 folder 1 is all funeral cards from 1875 to 1985. So if you're looking for information about the deaths that the Ocampo family recorded within their personal collections, you can find from quite a few funeral cards from this particular collection from 1875 to 1985. And that, again, is another really great resource to possibly find genealogical information of a family that you're looking for. Wedding announcements, birth announcements, vital statistics, school records, wills, telegrams, thank you cards, literally everything. So as Charmaine is scrolling through here, you can literally see, just if you're looking for a specific item, just make sure if you're looking to contact the repository that a collection is at, that you write down what box and what folder and the name of that particular thing that you're looking for in it, so that you can have the ability to let either the repository and the archivist know what you're looking for, and they would be able to get that information to you either digitally or, once you're able to go back to viewing things in person, they would be able to pull that information for you and have it available in the reading room for you to go ahead and look at if you're looking to go ahead and do that. And I will go ahead and pass this back over to Charmaine.
Thanks, Jessica. Okay, so in this next section, I'm going to discuss how my genealogical research led me to an archival object and how document analysis can lead to more sources of information. So the item on the screen is my great-granduncle, James Willis Brown's master thesis. So how I came across this document leads back to a much longer story, which I'll give you the shortened version. So my great aunt and I were talking about family history, and I brought up James Willis Brown because that was not a name that I was familiar with until I began doing my research. He passed away in 1965, and then his sister, which would have been my great-grandmother, passed away when she was young as well, or when she was young. He didn't pass away when he was young. When she was young, she passed away. So a lot of the information in the family kind of stopped, the information source. So I spoke to this great aunt about James Willis Brown, and she remembered him and told me that both her and her daughter, which is my mom's first cousin, told me that he was a professor at Payne College in Augusta, Georgia. So at that time, I contacted Payne College and contacted the library and said, hi, I'm the great-grand-niece of James Willis Brown. I'm very interested in learning more about him and his time at Payne College. So at that point, the librarian at Payne College sent me a zip file full of photographs of James Willis Brown, a memorial for him, different accounts from the college community about him, because he was not only a professor at Payne College, but he was a student as well. He received his undergraduate degree from Payne College. So I found out about his time as a student working for the yearbook. I found out that he was a football coach at one point, football team, as well as a history professor at Payne College. But it was the memorial that led me to this discovery that I have on the screen today. So the memorial listed that he received his master's degree in history at the University of Detroit. So I'm actually born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. So I was shocked to find that connection, which was previously unknown. So I contacted the University of Detroit, which is now called University of Detroit Mercy because of the merger. But I contacted the archivist there and said, or emailed, do you have anything on James Willis Brown? He was my great granduncle, yearbook photos, just anything in general. So she did not have any photographs of James Willis Brown, but she did have his master thesis, which is the present status of the Negro in South Carolina. And this thesis was completed in 1935, or at least submitted in 1935. So I asked for a copy of this, and she actually made a copy for the library and sent me the original thesis. So I was pretty excited to have that, considering this is a historic document from 1935. And she stamped a scar on it, so no one thinks that I stole from the archive. But now I have this great archival object in my own personal collection. So when we talk about document analysis, it's easy for us to go to personal information, the name, parents, just the basic information that we see on firsthand when we're looking at a document. So I brought up this document because, initially you think this is just an item that you read for research and not necessarily a genealogical item, but it can be. So upon my first look through this document, I noticed that on the front page, it says by James Willis Brown, Denmark, South Carolina, August 1934. So this is an important genealogical fact because to my knowledge, we hadn't had any Brown family members who lived in South Carolina in contemporary times. Historically, going back, before 1870, I did find we have South Carolina roots, but not contemporary roots. So now with this admission that he was in Denmark, South Carolina in August 1934, that gives me another area to research in. And there are a couple years on the United States Census that I cannot find this uncle. So perhaps he was in South Carolina. The second thing I noticed, which may not be necessarily a genealogical fact, but the second thing I noticed about finding this document and the other documents that the librarian sent me is that he must have been of strong character, having been a Black man from a small town in Georgia during that period, going off to Michigan to study and get his master's degree in the 30s. That's not something that people did every day. I also think about how conscientious it was for him to write about the topic of the status of Black people in South Carolina during that time. He could have chose whichever thesis topic, but he chose this topic. I also found it interesting that he decided to write about South Carolina versus Georgia, where he was born and raised. So this leads to more questions and more thoughts, and maybe I can take my research into South Carolina and learn more about him and subsequently about the rest of my family. So the third thing I noticed about this document is the acknowledgements section, which I'll just tell you about rather than showing you, but it's towards the back of this document. The acknowledgement mentions several names of different individuals. And so that's also something that I can research at a later date to find out how they were connected to him, if it was only a professional acquaintance, but the acknowledgements could also be someone who was part of the family as well. So many of you do have personal or items of personal or historic significance in your own homes. I challenge you to think about these kinds of items and what information that you can glean from them, just like I gleaned from this thesis, and which is leading to more research questions. Okay, so in this slide, I'm going to be discussing a little bit more about document analysis. So document analysis, when you first look at this document or any document, it can be tempting to just pull the basic information that you learn, whether it be a name, race, birth date, death date. All of those things are great, but it's important to make note of the other information as well. For example, on a United States Census, there are neighbors listed on both sides of your ancestors. It's important to learn more about these neighbors because they're a part of what genealogists call the fan club, which stands for friends, associates, and neighbors. Neighbors often migrated with one another and married and even served as witnesses to land and other legal documents. So in this particular document that we're looking at, this is a World War I draft registration card for another great-granduncle. So questions I always keep in mind when thinking about document analysis is, what can I learn from this document? How can this lead to additional information or information sources? So some quick observations about this card is the thought that, or the curiosity, if Valen Richardson, my great-granduncle, actually served in the military. It was required that males of a certain age or register for World War I or for the registration card. And so he could have military records, or they might not exist, but it's something worth looking into as well. And then when I look at his age and when this document is signed, that can let me know also whether or not he may or may not have served in the First World War. My second observation is that the record is signed, just right there at the bottom. This means that he was literate, which is important because the validity of information changes whether or not they were literate or not. Those who are illiterate, usually there would be an X, and then it would say his sign or her sign next to it to indicate that they signed. And so when we think about literacy at the time, if someone was perhaps illiterate, I would have to then kind of question the information that is being presented on a document, because we basically have to assume that the person who is writing or recording the information was recording in the proper columns or recording it even properly at all. But with this document, we know that he signed it, and so I can pretty much accept that this information is indeed for fact. So the next thing I noticed about this registration card in my analysis is his occupation. It says lumber oiler. So I wasn't familiar with that type of occupation, but upon researching, I learned that an oiler in general is someone that oils machinery. So in his case, working for a lumber company, he would be oiling the lumber machinery, which was interesting to know. I also noted his employer's name, which is Morse Brothers Lumber Company, located in Helen, White County, Georgia. So I could take this employer's name or information and I could research about the Morse Brothers Lumber Company. I can learn the company's history. I can learn where they were located in Helen, Georgia. I could learn if there's any files or records left from this company somewhere in an archive or a local courthouse or a local type of repository. And then thus by finding those company records, I might find something about my great-granduncle, his employee records. So obvious information you can glean from this registration card is, of course, his birth date and his nearest relative. And so the nearest relative column is very important. In this case, it is his father, Bias Richardson, whose name I already knew. However, sometimes the nearest relative is a cousin or some other type of relation, and it isn't necessarily notated. Sometimes it's a neighbor. So it's important to document and research whoever is listed as a nearest relative and learn more about them as well. And then, just for fun, I found it interesting that he was listed as tall for his height, because my Richardson family members have been tall throughout history and currently in recent generations. So if you had a more robust document outside of like a registration card, you would have more information to analyze, more of an opportunity to draw information, to learn more about your ancestors. And so there's a lot more that can be said for document analysis. And I have added a link from the National Genealogy Society in the handout for you to learn more, read more later about document analysis. So lastly, I did want to mention that there were a couple genealogy books that would help you on your genealogy research journey. So the first one is the Everything Guide to Genealogy, 3rd edition by Kimberly Powell. And the second one is the Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy, 2nd edition by Blaine T. Bettinger. So Blaine T. Bettinger is the go-to person when it comes to anything genetic or DNA related when it comes to genealogy. And he also has a website, which I linked in the handout. Reading that book, or his book, especially the 2nd edition, was very crucial to me understanding more about genetic testing and DNA and how that works, and the limitations of that when it comes to your own research. So, and with that, that concludes our presentation, and I will hand the screen back to Amelia.
Hi, Charmaine and Jessica. Thank you so much for going through this tonight. I feel like we have just had like an action-packed, densely filled hour of resources and information, and everything you've covered about, noting the boxes, noting the folder numbers, having a research question in mind, music to my ears as the helper on the other end of the email, right? That's helping to put people in contact with their materials. And I just really love the kind of depth that you've brought to this research. It feels like you're detectives on the hunt. And we actually had a comment come in saying, Charmaine, that if you started a webinar series about your family history, we would be tuning in to find out more. It's just, I feel like these little tidbits you've shared with us tonight are fascinating. So we have a little bit of time and before we're going to call it a night, and I just wanted to open it up for questions. So if you're here with us still, please feel free to submit your question, and I'm just going to kind of see what we've had come in. So we've had this really great question actually that I would like to start with. So with women's last names, right, like things can get a little tricky because which name are we looking for? And how can we determine a married woman's maiden name? Can you provide any kind of suggestions for how to make that jump if you don't have that information?
Yes, definitely. That's a little bit of a difficult one. I've encountered that situation many a time. So the first thing I do is go to the children and go to their marriage records, because sometimes the marriage records have to list, or I think often the marriage licenses have to list the parents' names. And so you could possibly find the maiden name from the marriage license. And I would suggest doing that for all of the children of the woman that you're trying to find the maiden name from, because I've noticed that different children list different maiden names for one particular mother. The second thing I would go to is the death certificates for the children. Those would also list the mother's maiden names. And once again, you have to go through all of the siblings or all of the children of the mother, because sometimes there will be conflicting information that way. And so once you've done all of that research, then you could go back and maybe try to narrow it down and research one maiden name over another maiden name that was given by the children. And what I found often is the mother may have married before she got married to the children's fathers. And sometimes that first marriage or married name is listed as a maiden name by some of the children who may have been younger than some of the older ones who may have known that information. So that's why some of the discrepancies happen.
Yeah, it really strikes me that there seems to be just a lot of sideways entry into things, you know, that you're not finding the information directly, you're finding it through these related documents, or like what Jessica was saying, you're looking in collections of things that maybe don't have, like right here in a bright red banner, you know, information found here, but you're trying to find these like sideways entries into the material. This question, I think, you know, is a good one for Jessica. So the first slide that we had here tonight showed a person wearing gloves. So can you talk about wearing gloves? This is not necessarily a genealogy collection, but it's one I think is worth answering. What type of gloves do you recommend, and like in what context do we wear gloves?
Yes, thank you. So, you know, as archivists, we know that you're not supposed to be touching materials with your bare hands, because your hands have oils and your hands have motion, different things on them, and so that can transfer on to either a document or a photograph and can cause damage over time for the material. And so what we recommend usually within our project is that if you can't find gloves that have some type of powder-free nitrile gloves usually are the best ones if you are looking for just disposable gloves. But if you can find white gloves that are not something, we have archives kits that we give out to people, and they're just like really kind of like, I don't want to call them cheap, but you know, you can get them in archival quality, just as long as your hands are covered and they don't have, you know, you can't get smudges or anything on them. Those are the types of gloves that you're looking for. But disposable gloves, nitrile, powder-free, please make sure powder-free for sure is the type of gloves. But if you can find gloves that are usually handed out, just make sure that they cover your hands and that, you know, you don't get any smudges on materials for your collection.
Great, thank you. This one, I'm not sure, I don't know the answer to this, so I'm just going to ask it and you will let me know. But can one transfer information directly from Family Search into Ancestry? Is there a way to kind of streamline that process, or do you have to make the Family Search download and then do the upload into Ancestry? Or do we not know?
I can't say that I'm unsure how to answer that. I always do the downloading route.
That's what I'm familiar with. So we're going to say that is the known solution, and anyone who knows a better route is free to send an email and give us the hot news. So I do want to just take this time. We did have a couple of questions come in. So there is a handout that we have referenced. It is available on our website for tonight, the page that you went to register for tonight's program. It is linked there. Anyone who is not able to find that, please feel free to reach out at library@nha.org, and I am very happy to send a copy to you. And also any questions that we aren't able to answer tonight, please also do reach out, library@nha.org, and we are very happy to work with you to get the answers you're looking for. And the names of the books are also included on the handout. So this is, okay, great. So this is a question about the handwriting, Charmaine. So how did you determine that your relative was a lumber oiler and not a lumber piler? You know, a lumber piler stacks lumber on kiln cars, like piling lumber. So how do you know?
That's a good question. I just went from my own eyesight, but who knows? It might be a P in there too. I'd have to look at that more with a magnifying glass, but I assumed it was oiler from just me looking at the document and observing that it appeared to be an O. But yeah, with handwriting, that's kind of a tricky thing. You just do your best in trying to interpret that cursive, and sometimes not even cursive, handwriting of the period.
Yeah, I will say as archivists, we definitely do try to, I don't know, there are some classes that are available if somebody is interested. Like they're high-level classes though, to kind of like distinguish handwriting, especially handwriting from like the 19th and early 20th century, because there was a lot of cursive, and nowadays we really just don't write in cursive. And so sometimes people really do have an issue reading in cursive. And so it just takes practice over time to be able to kind of pick out letters and numbers and stuff like that when you're looking through records. So it's just more of a muscle memory. Just as you keep looking at things, it kind of comes clearer to you about what the words are and what they kind of look like, especially if you're not familiar with cursive handwriting. You just have to practice at it. And that is the key to kind of getting you to understand the difference between the letters. It takes time. I'm still learning to this day myself. It does take quite a bit of time.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. And I am now going to make a plug for, if you're looking for opportunities to improve your ability to read cursive handwriting, we do have a really strong transcription program, and we are always looking for volunteer transcribers to help us out. So it's a really great opportunity to kind of get your hands dirty with learning different kinds of handwriting, especially because it tends to be mid-19th century men with questionable, education, and is it a 19th century type, like, is it there, did they misspell the word? Have you just not quite figured out the handwriting? Is it a way that's changed over time, the word, or is it a jargon, whaling specific term? So anybody who's looking for that, please feel free to help us out with the transcription. How do you determine correct census information when one interpretation has been documented one way and you read it differently?
This is a good question. I guess I would say I would probably study, and then we're talking about census documents.
That's right.
I would study the handwriting on previous pages of that same census, and study the letters and the handwriting of the enumerator, and make comparisons between what you have viewed or interpreted versus what was interpreted earlier, because it could have been incorrect earlier. There's no telling with that, but I would say study the handwriting throughout the census document, not just the page in which your ancestor is, and make your analysis from there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Even with the materials we have here, so the Barney genealogical record, before it was online, right, it was and is obviously in these handwritten ledgers. And so sometimes the way that Eliza, her handwriting is, it's like, has she misspelled this name, or is it just a quirk of her handwriting? And so, yeah, I definitely think that makes sense to just be checking, trying to get a better sense of the handwriting of the census taker. This is, I feel like, a really good question for both of you. So with, especially with HIPAA now, are there any suggestions for getting medical records for deceased relatives? And the specific inquirer wants to know about deceased relatives in a mental institution. And this is in 1945, but I don't know if you have any insight into medical records and how one can get access to those, if at all.
I actually haven't done that yet in my genealogical journey. The closest I get to a medical record is a death certificate. I guess I would look up the local laws and the local policies surrounding those types of records and who would be able to request. It's usually, I would say, next of kin, but then if that next of kin has already passed, I would probably research the laws and policies in the municipality that you're doing your research in.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Charmaine. As you stated, HIPAA is very, very regimented where this particular information is concerned on people. And so you do have to kind of be a little bit careful when you're trying to obtain medical records. And so if there is possibly a family member or somebody along those lines that would be able to have some insight into, was there a next of kin, or if there was a family member who, possibly had a power of attorney or something along those lines that could transfer some type of information. But I do agree with Charmaine, look up the local laws and possibly call the institution and see if they have some type of, a span to where they keep records. A lot of institutions only keep records under concealment for so long. And so 1945 might be within the range of them to release those records because it isn't necessarily under current HIPAA regulations. And so it just honestly depends on the institution and kind of what those particular rules are when it comes to very old records, because there might just be a certain amount of time that they would keep those confidential and then they would open them up to people. And so 1945 might be a long enough time for them to open those records up to people to get that information.
Yeah, and I think my understanding as well is that there's some ambiguity as to whether, at least based on my minimal experience in this area, but that there can be some interpretation as to whether HIPAA is retroactive and how far back it goes, and the same with FERPA and education records as well, as to you know, they are definitely being enforced for today, but going back to these early 20th century and earlier records, just whether or not those apply or are being implemented in these institutions. So yeah, that's really great advice, Ben. Thank you. Do you have any thoughts about, so documenting siblings and ancestry, are there any I don't know if this is, I don't know, are there any rules for including brothers, sisters, half-brothers, half-sisters? Any comments on that?
No, there's not any rules that I'm aware of. I add all siblings when I'm creating my family trees, even if they're half siblings. I even add adopted siblings, especially if they were in the family and considered, you know, a whole part of the family. I include adopted family members as well. In Ancestry, you can notate if a parent is an adopted, I want to say, or at least step parent. So you can make the distinction between the full sibling or the adopted sibling versus the other siblings in the family tree on Ancestry. And I know you can add multiple spouses to a husband or a male and have the tree descend down in that way. And so the first partner, and then those children from the first partner, and then second partner, and the children from that partner. So I would document everybody who's a part of the family, even if they aren't a full sibling or even if they're adopted.
Yeah, what I'll say about that is that for my personal genealogical family tree history, this is very important because I didn't grow up with my father's side of the family. And so I am in a completely different section of the family tree. And so if I didn't have that documentation of brothers, sisters, half-sisters, I don't think that I would even be able to research my family if I didn't have that information, because I did not grow up in my direct father's line of family, and so they don't have a lot of information about me. And so for me to be able to upload my information and have connections with my father's family and my extended family is of great importance to me. And so yeah, I do agree with Charmaine that if it is possible to document brothers, half-brothers, sisters, adoptions, you know, anything along those lines, please go ahead and do, because that sometimes is a really great information for people like myself who are not directly connected to the family line and need that information in order to kind of figure out your genealogical line.
Excellent, thank you. You had more information on that topic than I had anticipated, so glad I asked. We have time for just a couple of more questions, so we're going to just wrap up the Q&A. And the last question that I wanted to bring up is, have either of you done research with military records, and can you maybe share some information on any tips there?
I have very limited experience with military records, but I know the National Archives has a complete section on military records, and I can post that link in the chat.
And we are also able to add that to the handout, and we're able to share that if you have an update. Great. So I don't any comment from you, Jessica, on military records?
No, what I'll say is, again, those particular records do fall under, federal regulation as well. And so it can be really difficult sometimes to find those records or have access. And so the National Archive really is probably the best resource available to people to kind of find that information. And then if you have particular information about possibly where your family member was stationed or what fort they were at or anything along those lines, that might be a really great resource to you to kind of see if that if you can pull that record or maybe call whatever station they're at and see if they have an archive or are willing to share information with people. Again, it just depends on kind of the regulations of the federal government regarding military records. But yeah, I absolutely suggest National Archive is a really good resource to look at to find those records.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so that's the last question we have time for this evening. And so I just want to remind everyone, if you have any lingering questions, if we weren't able to get to you tonight, please feel free, library@nha.org. Very happy to respond. And I just want to thank you all so much for spending a part of your evening with us tonight. Media sponsorship for this evening's event is generously provided by Novation Media. Please join us on March 10th, which will be our next Food for Thought with artist MJ Levy-Dixon. And NHA University will start back up in March with a focus on Nantucket's geographic connections. Programs such as this one are made possible thanks to the support of our members. So if you are not a member, please do consider joining by heading to nha.org/membership. Thank you all so much and have a great night.